So when I conclude basically, this fairy tale, I think the most important part is that it's very hard to agree on financial performance. Never limit it just to profits, and always think about growth whenever you make an incentive, because growth is something where there's a short-term incentive to invest and grow. I really think it's a strong disincentive.
But is the answer not that you should really be looking into what type of financial metric you should be using for the specific company? I think your example, this company with the concrete base, etc. There, you can manipulate indeed. As you said, you can manipulate a certain metric. But if the board clearly outlines what the target for the CEO is to grow the company, then you measure it on sales growth, for example. But of course, you cannot just do that without ignoring the profit margin. But if you set the right metrics that the board wants the company to achieve, then you can still use financial measures, no?
Let's come to the...
Put thought in it. I agree with you. You shouldn't just say profit or whatever, but if you put thought in it as a board to say, these are the metrics that I want the company to achieve, because that's good for the company in the long run, you can still use financial measures to incentivize the company.
Just keep in mind that we will never agree on the financial performance. Even if you make up your mind what the right metrics are, at the end of the day, there won't be agreement that achieving these metrics has actually been a good performance.
So why is that?
We can't agree on performance. There's so many aspects on it.
No, but I mean, in a single company board, maybe the whole society can't agree on what is the best for company A, for company B. The board of company A hopefully can sit down together, and I'm not saying this is something for 10 minutes, but if they really go for it and say, what do we really want for the company? Firstly, what do we want the company to do? Grow profits, to be stable, to do whatever, global penetration. Then you measure what you want, then you put down the goals, and then you say, okay, how are we going to measure those goals? Again, you need to put thought in this, but hopefully the board can between themselves, and the board and the CEO can agree on what the targets are.
Well, the situation is, I experience in any group that I, put together, that there's not an agreement on performance. Never. There's always several different years that people think are the best years. Probably, and that's maybe a little bit, a difficult message for you, that financials are not sufficient to assess performance of a company. And what I would learn for me is we have to be really careful when designing a compensation system based on financials. This is really what I want to say. I just want to tell you, at the end of the day, when you look at the performance, there's always going to be disagreement.
It's difficult to be convincing.
Yeah, I've never experienced another situation. There were always other opinions. And if you add more numbers to look at, there's not more agreement.
It's complicated.
It gets just more complicated. I think what we probably have to learn again is to be more suspicious of numbers when it comes to incentive compensation. I'm not saying you don't have to look at the numbers. They tell a lot. But linking compensation to financial numbers is extremely dangerous, and the recommendation is use several metrics, that kind of mitigates the problem up to a certain degree, and use less leverage. And let's go afterwards to the targets that you just spoke about, because this is my third story. We believe when we set a target for a CEO or for a person, and we link a bonus to that this person is going to reach that target. Is more likely going to reach that target. I think executives should have targets, but they should not be rewarded for reaching their targets. Very fine difference. Targets are important, we know that, but incentivizing on targets is extremely dangerous. I brought you an example too. I've been using that for a while. I already did it in 2009 actually. I have 3 companies here where I show the historic profit. Keep it simple, just look at the profit. We have to look at every metric individually. Where would you set the target? Gildemeister is a machine manufacturer that grew the profit reasonably well over time, is at a certain point. Novartis had a difficult year 2007, had a big recovery in 2008, and Raiffeisen, of course, as a bank, was hit hard in 2008 from the financial crisis. Where would you set the target? There are many, many different targets you can set. Let's just take a few. Let's assume Gildemeister will say, like, we are happy with this high level that we have achieved. Let's just stay there. Let's say Novartis said, we just survived 2007, you know, I don't think we have to really set our target as high as the best years we've ever had in the history. They may set their target here. And Raiffeisen probably thinks this has been a really bad year. Let's assume we are back up here afterwards. So this is just an assumption, which typical forecasting would work that way. Now, let's look at what really has happened to these companies. Novartis was actually much better, reached their peak in 2009. Gildemeister had a terrible year 2009, we know. After the credit crisis, there was a big slump in investment. And Raiffeisen actually did come back, as expected, as you may have expected from the past. But the more interesting part now is, was that a good performance? What I've done is, I've looked at the peers of these companies. How well did the peers do? I start with Novartis. The peers I've used to do this analysis are from the Novartis annual report. It's the peers they use to benchmark their compensation. The peers performed a lot better in 2009 than Novartis. Novartis, with a top performance compared to their history, was actually in the lowest quartile. And the interesting part is, you know what the board decided in 2010? It's actually in their annual report. They decided 2009 was such a good year that they have to pay Daniel Vasella more than that is allowed in their regulations. And they had to make an exceptional decision in the board to pay more than what he was allowed by their own statutes. That's how they assessed 2009. Because, probably he exceeded the targets that they set the year before. Who knows?
Sorry, it's difficult to believe that the board doesn't look at these figures.
It is amazingly difficult to believe. Huh? I'm amazed. I'm really amazed that they don't look at that.
Maybe now they do.
No, they don't do. The situation where people don't look at these numbers, they don't want to know the truth. They have invested a lot of time setting the target. They have achieved the target. And when you look at their annual report, it actually says, we achieved the targets that we set ourselves. And this is much more important than what anybody else does, because it could taint their picture. What do you do in this situation where all the targets are reached, but you underperformed? Do you say, our targets were bad? Impossible.
No, they will lose face.
They will lose face, exactly.
Give an additional bonus to Vasella if you...
Lose face, but that's important, That's important. You focus, on your own processes. Actually, the CEO that I told you got an 80,000 raise just for nothing. At the same lunch, he told me that he also wanted to forfeit his bonus. He didn't want to take his bonus because he had such a bad year. And you know what the board told him when he said, I don't want to have the bonus for this year? What's your guess?
You have to take it.
You have to take it. Why? Why do you have to take it? Because it's a very bad sign towards outside if we suddenly agree our performance was bad. The investor relations told him to take it. The board told him to take it. He could not take the bonus because of what it communicates towards the outside world.
The problem is transparency. The problem is transparency. If nobody would have known what he was being paid, he could have forfeited that bonus. See, the outside world...
Yeah, the problem is again transparency. We're coming back to the introduction of the speech, absolutely. Now let's look at what happened to Raiffeisen. Here actually we have a very much the same picture as our goal would have set. The interesting why I like to show this slide is it's amazing how much a company is aligned with the peers. And that's another reason why people don't like to look at peers. It's quite sobering at the end of the day that you can outperform the peers by a little bit, but by never as dramatic as you would like to. It's just the reality. And the reality for most companies, we do such benchmarks for companies that use it in compensation purposes, a benchmark. The reality, the average of our companies that use our index are at the 50th percentile. Kind of makes sense and makes you think, why should we want to reward a CEO for reaching a target? Doesn't make sense. Even worse, if you look at Gildemeister had a terrible year, but they outperformed their peers. Now, what do typical boards do when they see something like that, you know? They actually haven't been that good, you know, without looking at the peers, haven't been that good in the past, but this has been a dreadful year for them. They typically start with restructuring projects. Is it a good idea to start a restructuring project when you manage the crisis better than anybody else? It's not. That's why I think it's much better to not set your compensation based on targets.
They don't have any meaning though. If you say this is what I'd like you to do, this margin is what I like, but you're not going to get paid for that. Wow. How does the CEO react? I mean, I agree with what you're saying. I'm just wondering, everybody's kind of at the end of the day thinking about incentives. And if the targets don't mean anything for me financially, maybe I don't care.
Yeah. We shouldn't forget that until about 20 years ago, UBS didn't have a bonus here in Switzerland. Until about 20 years ago, incentives for executives have been completely absent. And they also worked quite well. I mean, there are so many incentives in a CEO role. Think of it, you know, getting a job in a bigger company for most CEOs. After retirement, becoming a board member. These are all financial incentives. The pride, you know, which is a very good incentive, the pride. These are all strong incentives for CEOs to perform well. And there is the peer pressure. The board knows what the people are doing. They can talk to each other. And you cannot just do nothing. It's impossible. You have to perform. And now when it comes to how good are boards actually in setting targets? How good are they actually? There was a research that I read in Daniel Kahneman's book that 2,000 US CFOs were asked where their share price is next year, and where it actually had the lowest likelihood of all the predictions. I made an analysis and I said, okay, in case people are good at target setting, would mean that, you know, on average, the boards get their targets more or less right and pay when people are above average, they pay more, and when people are below average, they pay less. If I assume the target setting is done well, I would find in the data whenever companies perform well, their pay is higher. So when they're better than the peers, their pay is higher. Whenever companies perform worse than their peers, the pay is lower, because the target setting was done so well that you knew what was possible for that company. And I analyzed the payments of the CEOs and compared it to their relative performance against their peers. Can you follow me? I used, you know, how much they have received and how well they performed relative to their peers. So this would now be an outperformance bonus. Raiffeisen would have an average bonus, and Novartis would have received the below average bonus if the target setting were right. And this is what I found out in the US. If you look at performance here, you know, how many peers did I outperform? And the millions that actually CEOs received is what you see up there. There's no correlation. There's no correlation. So any targets that were set in the US, even what you don't see here, it's over a period of 3 years. So a period of 3 years, not just 1 year. Any target setting that was done in the US didn't have a correlation with the payments that they actually paid out. Same in the United Kingdom, and in Switzerland, it's even worse. And I did this analysis 2 or 3 years ago, got even into The Economist, which made me really happy. But just this summer, Bloomberg did the analysis. And on July 22nd, they showed stock return rank versus CEO pay rank for 200 executives in the US, and they have an R-square of 0.01. My conclusion is targets are outdated the minute you set them. You should not use targets for incentive purposes. You should only use them for management purposes. It's already 1:10. I come to the last slide. Compensation without fairy tales. Don't blame the executives for the problem of executive pay. Find the solution with the regulators and the shareholder value enthusiasts who still ask for more transparency and more leverage pay. Be very careful with any profit-based metric. While I agree it's an important metric, it's probably one of the most important metric, don't forget that growth suffers, and at the end of the day, people cannot agree on performance. Using more metrics and maybe some personal judgments helps mitigate that problem. And finally, and that is really, really true, don't set bonus targets for incentive purposes. They're outdated the minute you set them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael.